and a whistleblower on the Rochdale grooming gang case, founder of the Maggie Oliver Foundation, a wonderful one. Maggie, welcome to Talk Drive. How are you?
Hi, Jeremy. I'm fine, thank you. Sad again about this horrendous case.
Been too long. I've so much to talk to you about. I've just had a sit-down row with a former director of social services in Wiltshire who blatantly refused to criticise colleagues. This is right. Told me that, didn't mention Sara Sharif until 8 minutes in, but told me that 14 years of austerity under the Tories, the lack of police on the streets, the pressure on social workers to deliver targets was the reason. Not, it would seem, Maggie, what I read out earlier, which is that neighbours would hear gut-wrenching screams coming from the home, which was followed often by a woman screaming. Concerned teachers seeing bruises. She wore the outfit, and even then bruises were relevant. They'd made complaints. Police had made complaints. But astonishingly, Surrey Social Services decided not to look into the family. Can you put into words, unless it is just me, how completely and utterly abhorrent that is, and how, in my mind, maybe you disagree, these people are complicit in her death, aren't they?
I mean, if I could swear, Jeremy, I would swear, because this, again, is a catalogue of missed chances and missed opportunities. And this little girl suffered a life of violence and neglect. And from the day she was born, she was on the Child Protection Register. You know, the authorities were called 15 times, made aware. She was taken out of school. She was put in a hijab to hide her bruises. She was high risk, and we have a duty of care. And whilst I possibly would agree with a little bit of what that Director of Social Services has said, I would say that this is a problem that has existed for decades. When I joined the police, Jeremy, you know, I was horrified by children being failed by social services on a monumental scale. When I joined the police, I wanted to go into child protection. But the number of times that I would be horrified that a child was being left in a place that was unsafe, that was abusive, and being told that the social services were working with the family. Now, I would admit, or I would agree, that things have got worse because of, you know, a lack of training, unmanageable workloads. But the thing is, these things should not happen. We have repeated serious case reviews into these cases, but anybody with an ounce of common sense could look at this and see the risks there. You know, time after time, this little girl had human bite marks. She had burns from cigarettes. She was burnt with an iron, head injuries. I think 25 broken bones. And her family, her father and her stepmother, took her out of school to homeschool her. Well, you know, there should be a system that checks up on children that are being homeschooled. They don't just suddenly disappear.
I completely, Maggie, I completely agree with you. It almost, I have to say, listen, people say I have an opinion on everything. I really, it makes me sick to the stomach, and I mean, the whole thing makes me sick to the stomach, and I acknowledged earlier, there are many instances where social services do a great job and we don't hear that, but this is a complete and utter dereliction of their duty. There's no common sense in this. And then we go further and we find that the father, Urfan Sharif, who I think should rot in hell for all eternity, exploited, this is my favourite bit, if there is one, exploited EU rules to stay in the UK by using a human rights lawyer paid by you and me and everybody else listening, i.e. taxpayers, married in a sham marriage a Polish girl so he could stay in this country. Seriously, Maggie, before I talk about the other one, because it's one of the big things, what does that say? What is wrong with us?
It says that we're, as a country, we are pushovers for people who are playing the system. And you know, Jeremy, because we've spoken before, but on the Rochdale case, that is the one I'm known about, although now in my charity, we help any survivor of sexual abuse, not just grooming gangs. But, you know, in that case, the main abusers who abused dozens, if not hundreds of children, they used human rights legislation to avoid deportation by having the nerve to say that they were entitled to a family life. well, I'm sorry, when you behave in that way that is inhumane, that you destroy dozens of children's lives, your own rights, for me, go out of the window. And if you want to share your life with your family, take your family back to where you should be. We shouldn't be giving them a home and supporting them. This guy...
£500,000 house in Woking, Surrey.
Who has got that?
The father. They lived in a £500,000 house in Surrey in Woking.
Unbelievable.
I mean, completely unbelievable. And then I go further, and this is why you're the ideal person to speak to, because, and I haven't got into trouble for this, but a lot of people find this an astonishing statement. I'm utterly convinced that the whole reason it took 8 years for the Rotherham grooming gangs to be brought to justice was because of two-tier policing, because I suspect greatly, and I could be wrong, that the police were worried about... Or maybe they've admitted it, maybe they haven't, that they could create, you know, tension in certain communities if they're arrested. These were British Pakistani men. If you put the boot on the other foot, and these have been, you know, right-wing, bigoted, whatever, absolutely gone on a heartbeat. So then I look at this today, and then again in my head it goes, are we now looking at the beginnings in this country of two-tier social work? Was nothing done because this was... I don't know, but it does beg questions, Maggie, doesn't it?
I mean, there's a lot of questions. You know, we need systemic changes, in my opinion, in all our public services. And, you know, when I started to speak out, the fear of Islamophobia was rife. But for me, it is a very relevant part of the conversation. But for me, as a serving police officer, my duty was to protect children. And it didn't matter where they came from or where the abusers came from. The law says you can't rape a child who is 10 or 11. End of. And with this, the duty of care extends to every child. And this child was on the child protection register from the day she was born. Where were the social workers with a bit of common sense, who had instincts, who looked at this little girl and thought she needs protecting? Her father had already been arrested for very violent offences. One of the siblings was also at risk. The children had disclosed to teachers, to professionals, that they were being violently abused. There should have been immediate action, and this little girl should still be alive. And the people who allowed this to happen should hang their heads in shame. And the Director of Social Services, who is saying, you know, there are reasons, and he's blaming lack of funding, that is not the full issue. People have responsibility, and they have a duty of care. They should look at this and err on the side of caution. I mean, what I would say, Jeremy, is that we're dealing with cases where children are ripped from the heart of a family on the most minor reasons. Something like this, it's as plain as the nose on your face that this little girl was at risk. There was no action, and it was too late to save her life. But let's have systemic change. Let's have proper scrutiny of where public services are failing, whether it's police, the courts, the prisons, or social services. They are our public services, and if they don't work, we are in a lot of trouble, which I fear we really are.